Right, so today, like I said, we're going to cover ancient Christianity, 30 to 500 AD. This is a really unique period of history because throughout the last 2,000 years, Christians have been looking back to this period, the first decades, the first centuries of the church, to find guidance. And there's a sense in which if you can look back and say that Christians were doing things a certain way or teaching things a certain way in the first years of the church, then those beliefs or teachings have more authority, because obviously we're closer to the time of the Lord himself and his own apostles. So if you can make an appeal back to this era, it adds authority to what you're teaching. In fact, there have been church movements throughout the history of the Christian faith that have justified themselves by saying, hey, we're going back to the example of the early church. We're doing what the earliest Christians did. There's a movement in the early 1800s called the Restorationists that made this very claim. They said, we are not Catholics, we're not Protestants, we are going back to the example of the earliest Christians, and we're following their example before all these other traditions developed. So for that reason, the ancient period, it is especially interesting and unique to us. And it's good to study it and learn as much as we can about it. At the same time, I would just caution that just because Christians do things or did things in the first centuries of the church doesn't mean that's the best way to do them. Just because they related to God in a certain way doesn't mean that we should do the same thing. Some of the things they did because of culture, right? Because of context, because of the things to which they were reacting. So while it's good to look back and to get guidance and to see them as a sort of authority in how to live the Christian life, we have to moderate that, I think, by looking at the whole package, at the whole context, and seeing what is due to culture and what's really due to a true expression of the gospel. Right? What you're looking at here is a wall painting of a very early church gathering. These Christians are meeting together for a communion meal that they call the agape, the love feast. This is a wall painting on a catacomb. It's a tomb underground near Rome. All right, so let's go through those 5 focuses. The first is context. What was the context of the first centuries in which Christianity was growing and in which it was born as a new faith in the ancient world? I'm going to talk about 3 different sources, 3 different cultures. One was Greek culture, and Greek culture and its influence is called Hellenism because the original name for Greece was Helena. That's what the Greeks called their own country. Then we'll look at Roman culture. The Romans were in charge of the civilized world of the Mediterranean, so they certainly had an influence. And finally, Judaism. Of course, Christianity was born within Judaism, and the first Christians were Jews. Of course, our Lord was a Jew, humanly speaking. So Greek culture. Why did Greek culture spread so far? It's because of one guy, Alexander the Great. 300 years before Christ, this Macedonian young man, Alexander, son of Philip II, another king of Macedonia, he conquered what was then the Persian Empire as far as the Indus River in modern-day India and Pakistan. And in his wake and after his death, Greeks and Macedonians spread out to all the lands that he had conquered, and they spread their culture. So all the things they loved, they tried to sort of recreate their society in all these eastern lands and in Egypt and in Palestine. And so you had gymnasia. These were places for exercising. You had theaters built, just as you would find in Greece. We get a lot of our drama tradition from the Greeks. You even had research centers. In Egypt, there was a famous research center and library at the delta of the Nile at Alexandria. In fact, Alexandria was established by Alexander. It's named after him. So there was a big library there. They tried to collect every known book. There was also a research institute connected to it called the museum. That's where we get the word museum. So Greek ways, Greek learning, and Greek language spread through all of these lands you see in yellow. That's why the New Testament writers wrote the New Testament down in Greek. There was an Old Testament version a Greek translation of the Old Testament as well, which was written in the 3rd century, translated in the 3rd century, and it was called the Septuagint. And we know for a fact that several writers of the New Testament, when they quote the Old Testament in talking about Christ as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, they use the Septuagint. They quote from this Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And the reason, again, all this is in Greek is because of Alexander. So the Greeks they worshipped many gods. They did not worship one single god. Like the Romans, they were polytheistic, and I'll talk about polytheism in a second. Some Greeks were philosophers, and some of the greatest philosophers of the Western world hail from Greece. Without doubt, the most influential philosopher for early Christianity was this guy, Plato. And to sum up very quickly Plato's thought, Plato downgraded, he downgraded the world that we live in, and he spoke of another world called the world of forms, which he said was a perfect world. He didn't spell out exactly where this other world of forms was, but he differentiated this world of forms where everything's perfect and ideal. It's not a material world, it's a spiritual, intellectual, immaterial world. And Plato said the world we live in is a shadow, it's a copy of that world of forms. And here we are bound by matter, by material things, by these physical bodies that we live in. So Plato and those who followed him and those who were interested in his philosophy tended to downplay the value of material things and of the human body. And so some of the earliest false teachings that creep into the church are influenced by Plato, by Platonism. The view that the human body is evil in itself, that we need to shed the human body or ignore it in order to get closer to God. You can see in Plato's system how Christians would find a certain harmony with Christian teachings. Heaven is the world that's more real. Our world is temporary. It's fading. So Christians saw a lot of parallels between Plato's teaching and the Bible's teaching. But like anything else, we can take it too far, and some did take it too far, and they stressed things that I don't think are biblical. But definitely, Plato is the most influential. You've probably heard of Aristotle. He was another great Greek philosopher. The funny thing is, Aristotle's teachings weren't taught widely in the early church. And as the church spreads into Europe, very, very few Europeans know anything about Aristotle until the 12th century or 13th century, when his ideas are reintroduced. For all those centuries, it was Plato. He was the leading influence on a lot of Western minds. And then of several philosophies that came out of the period in the few centuries before Christ, a philosophy called Stoicism was very influential as well. Stoics doubted the existence of any kind of afterlife, and they were preoccupied with the question, how does one live this life well? They believed, unlike some other Greek philosophers, they believed that there was a force in the universe that gave order to all things. They called this the divine fire. Sometimes they called it the word or the logos, a word that Christians will use for Christ. But it wasn't a personal being, it was just a force. And because this force gives order to all things, Stoics believe that humans should face whatever comes to them with calmness, with calm and dignity. Whether you experience good or whether you experience terrible tragedy, you should face it calmly with dignity. And this philosophy became very popular among politicians and generals like Marcus Aurelius. He was a Roman emperor, and he was actually a Stoic philosopher as well. His journal, you can still read his thoughts or meditations, which are Stoic in nature. So Stoicism was very influential. And again, Christians found certain things that they could agree with in Stoicism. The fact that God orders everything we go through, we can face it calmly. But Christians would add, we can face it joyfully, because instead of this life being all there is, of course, we look forward to communion with God, to being with him in eternity. The Romans took over a lot of the Mediterranean and Europe as they expanded, as their empire expanded. And I think what was driving this this move to take over so much of the civilized world was the Romans' own self-image. This is captured in the Aeneid, which is an epic poem that tells the story. It's a fictional tale of how Rome was founded. And there's a very interesting part where the main character, Aeneas, who is destined to found the city of Rome and the civilization of Rome, he is told by his father, who is deceased, basically his father's ghost tells him this about his destiny. And this pretty much sums up how Romans thought of themselves, their place in the world. Aeneas' father says, "Roman, remember by your strength to rule earth's peoples, for your arts are to be these: to pacify, that is to bring peace, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, battle down the proud." So the Romans really believed the gods had given them the job, the purpose on this earth of taking over the world and bringing law and order to it. And to a large degree, they fulfilled that purpose. They did bring a measure of stability and order and peace where there had not been those things previously. They did bring a sort of uniform stability to a lot of the world of the Mediterranean. Just to show you very quickly how they expanded, the red areas in this map represent Rome's reach around 60 years before Christ. And then 200 years later, this is the extent. This was the furthest extent that Rome's power reached 117 years after Christ. And you can see much of the regions that border the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, as well as a good part of the British Isles, the Romans were ruling those areas. Like I said, the Romans, they brought stability, they brought good roads, they cleared the ocean of pirates, the roads were clear of bandits. To a large degree, this is what enabled the gospel to spread so successfully in its earliest years, because there were good roads, there were good seas, and there was one of two languages usually spoken, either Greek or Latin, throughout the Roman Empire. So a person like Paul, the apostle, could travel thousands of miles and share the gospel with lots of different ethnic groups just because he was a Roman citizen. As I mentioned, the Romans and the Greeks were polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many different gods, like Apollo. He's just one example. Sometimes when the Romans would take over new regions, they would often just adopt the gods of the local peoples into their own pantheon of gods. The Romans were pretty tolerant of different peoples worshiping different gods, as long as that people also gave honor to the emperor of Rome, sometimes even in a religious way, maybe burn incense to the emperor, confess that he is Lord. This would be a problem for Christians because they found they could not confess that the emperor was Lord and also that Jesus was Lord. And polytheism, it was infused into all of one's life. Even the food you bought in the market had been dedicated to these different gods. A lot of the public festivals, parades were dedicated to the gods. Things like sporting events, like the Olympics, was dedicated to Zeus. Drama plays were dedicated to Dionysus, another god. One of the reasons people were suspicious of Christians in the early years is because they participated in so few of these public events because of this aspect, because they were all dedicated to these, what Christians believed, false gods. Pretty much every culture except for the Jews and the Christians were polytheistic. So they were running up against this ideology. And third is Judaism. Of course, we know, like I said, the first Christians were the Jewish apostles and the Jewish disciples of Christ. And if you read the book of Acts, you know that it took some prodding from the Lord and persecution for the first Christians to get out of their comfort zone and to actually share the good news with non-Jews, with Gentiles. We see that with Peter and the centurion. And of course, Paul takes up the baton and he makes it his mission to share the gospel with non-Jews. But we can't forget that Christianity was born in the Jewish context, out of the Jewish faith, from a Jewish Messiah. Within the first century of the history of the church, it will become a majority Jewish faith to a majority Gentile faith. Within 100 years or so, there are very few Jewish people in the Christian church, and most are non-Jews or Gentiles. And we read in the New Testament there was opposition to the new faith among Jews. Some of Paul's greatest persecution came from his fellow Jews who didn't like this new faith. Jews were spread throughout the Mediterranean and also east into Mesopotamia. They were dispersed abroad, and they had synagogues where they would meet. These were their churches. They would meet in different areas. Some of the earliest Christian services were patterned after synagogue services. So some very basic elements that we still have today. There'd be a reading of Scripture, some commentary on Scripture, a song, a hymn. A couple social norms to be aware of. The ancient world had a sort of rigid hierarchy of status and rank. And it's hard for us as modern people to understand how at home a lot of people were with the idea that different people were born into different ranks in society, and that's just the way it was. There wasn't a lot of clamor in the ancient world for equality, which is kind of a more modern idea. I'm sure a lot of people wanted to improve their status. They wanted to be, treated better. They wanted more respect, but they didn't see it as something that was particularly unfair. It was just a fact of life. They were born into a certain status. Here you see a male citizen of Rome. He's wearing a toga, which was a sign of having that status, having those rights. In the mosaic, you can see some slave laborers. There were lots of slaves throughout the ancient world. What's interesting about Rome is that a slave could be freed by his master or her master and could actually become a Roman citizen under the right circumstances. That's sort of rare in the ancient world, but that's one of the things that helped Rome grow so quickly, is it would allow the people that it conquered and even their own slaves to become citizens later in life if they jumped through the right hoops. As far as gender roles, family roles, the society of that day was much more male-centered. Men had sort of absolute authority over their families and wives and their family's property. Now, among wealthier families, women had more freedom and more status. But in general, it was more common for women to stay indoors unless they had a very definite purpose for going outdoors into the public marketplace. Some middle class and poorer women, they were merchants, so they had to be in the marketplace. But again, in most places there's not a police force. So it was considered unsafe for a woman to just walk in public without a male companion. It was considered inappropriate for women to talk to men other than their husbands. This is very common in ancient society. So the ancient world is we would say, hierarchical and patriarchal is the words that we would use. Also, it's worth mentioning, to us, in some ways, they might seem a little callous in the way they viewed human life. If a family had a child that they could not support or didn't want, or was disabled, they could expose the child. They'd leave the child out in the open, out in the elements, either to die or for someone to pick up and adopt or use as a slave. That was pretty common. One of the things that made Christians distinct in these early centuries was that they never did that. They didn't expose their children. They were known for that. Also, especially among the poor, if someone died, they didn't always get a burial. Sometimes the dead were just left out in the open to be consumed by animals. Again, one of the things that Christians were known for in these early years was giving the dead a proper burial, even dead people that had not been Christians, just because of their respect for human life as made in the image of God. And that's something that they became known for as well. So from the very early years, Christians were known for protecting life and revering human life. Okay, so those are just some of the things we should know about the context. And let's move on to some of the big events of the early church of